Okay, we'll get started. So hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar on the minimum standards for public school approval in New Hampshire. These standards, you've also probably heard of them. They're also known as the 306s. That's their administrative rule number. And as you may know, these minimum standards are currently being revised and have important implications for what you teach and the conditions under which your students learn every day. I'm Megan Tuttle, and as president of NEA New Hampshire, it's my pleasure to welcome an amazing partner from Reaching Higher New Hampshire. Joining us tonight is Christina Pretorius, the Director of Policy. Educators in New Hampshire are very fortunate to have partners like Nicole, who couldn't make it here tonight, and Christina, and the organization for which they work, Reaching Higher New Hampshire. Reaching Higher's mission is to provide all New Hampshire children with the opportunity to prepare for college, for immediate careers, and for the challenges and opportunities of life in the 21st century in New Hampshire. Reaching Higher serves as a resource for public education policy and community engagement for New Hampshire families, educators, and elected officials. Like members of NEA New Hampshire, Reaching Higher believes that public education is one of our state's most precious assets, that all our public schools should be strongly supported by their surrounding communities, and that such support will help families and educators achieve the great student outcomes you strive for in your work every single day. Reaching Higher keeps the citizens of New Hampshire up to date on the latest policy developments and important issues affecting education, empowering individuals and communities to make well-informed decisions. This evening, Christine is going to be sharing information about the 306s, the minimum standards for public school approval. She'll share the status of revisions, as well as information about the organizations, the processes, and the activities that are being used to revise what you teach and what students need to graduate from high school. We've asked Christina to share information tonight, believing that you should be aware of the revisions to the conditions of your work, the expectations that are going to be placed on you, and we're hoping you're going to want to add your voice to the process of these revisions. Tonight's webinar is going to last approximately 1 hour. We are recording it, and we'll be putting the recording on the members section of the NEA New Hampshire website. If you have colleagues who are not able to join us tonight, but they are interested in learning about the revisions to the minimum standards, please let them know the recording will be on the website. If you think of any questions during the webinar that you would like Christina to address, please type your questions in the chat. We have staff members here from NEA New Hampshire that are monitoring the chat, and they will share your questions with Christina tonight. So now I'm going to turn the webinar over to Christina, and just thank you to everybody who's on the webinar tonight. Whatever your position in the school is, it really is appreciated more than you know. So thank you, Christina.
Thanks so much, Megan. What a great introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for being here tonight. Really excited to share our findings with you and really give you an overview of the process so far and really the next steps forward. So I'm going to quickly just share my screen so we can get started here. I'm going to try to get you right out at 7. But so this is a briefing. So this is a briefing on the proposed changes to the minimum standards for public school approval. These findings are based on a draft that was released on July 15th, 2022. It's the latest draft that's available at this time. There are pretty sweeping implications for the classroom, for students, for teachers, and for our public education system as a whole. So going in, we do just want to say, these are based on that draft. You can see that draft on our website. I can drop a link into the chat a little later. But just so everyone knows where we're coming from, the lens at which we're coming. As Megan had said, Reaching Higher New Hampshire is a nonprofit based in Concord, New Hampshire. We work to help lawmakers, the public, educators, really all stakeholders in education understand and engage in these processes in which all of these decisions are being made, whether that's at the State House, whether that's at the state board level. That's really our goal, and we come at this work with the lens of how important public education, public schools are to our communities and to our state. And so with that, just a quick overview of really what are the minimum standards for public school approval. These are administrative rules that really govern every public school in the state. because they are administrative rules, they are adopted by the New Hampshire State Board of Education. Every 10 years, they have to be up for reapproval. The last revision was in 2014, so these are the current version of the rules will be up in 2024. And so this work group, this contractor has been working on them for about 2 years now. And that's sort of the thinking in terms of, if they will be a little earlier than 2024, but this is sort of the timeline for that. These rules really lay the foundation for our public schools, for public school approval, including public academies. And something else that we really want to point out here is that other types of schools, so charter schools, non-public schools, adult high schools, those are governed in other rules. The ED 306s are really public schools, public academies. And this is going to be really important when we talk about some of the implications, particularly around the unbundling and outsourcing and the expansion of Learn Everywhere programs. Those are in other sets of rules. And so to bring some of those themes into the minimum standards for public school approval really raised our eyebrows, and is something that we will be watching really, really closely. If we're bringing those kinds of programs into our public schools like that, what implications will that have for our students, for our educators, for our schools? And so with that, we really distilled this rather large document into 5 key themes of these changes, of this overhaul. We'll get into a little bit of the process after we talk about the themes and sort of what can you do? What are the next steps? What are we anticipating going forward? But in terms of the key themes of these proposed changes, they really fall into 5 buckets. So those 5 buckets are around equity and student protections, around the program elements, really replacing very detailed program elements, what's included in courses and programs with boilerplate language, removal of local control. There's a new requirement included. And then we're going to talk a little bit about definitions that really minimize formal instruction and minimize the role of certified educators, which has really big implications for your work, for our schools. So these are the 5 really broad themes. We're going to go into a little bit of each of them. We're going to go pretty quickly, so feel free, if you have any questions, drop them into the chat. By all means, we can pause, we can sort of work through them a little bit more. I can slow down and zoom in on pieces that are particularly interesting to you. But since there are, these rather large themes, we might go a little quick. But any questions, let me know. There's also my email address at the end, and happy to have a conversation one-on-one if you'd like that too. So without further ado, let's start with the equity and student protections. This is the first one we start with because it's really student-centered, and we lead with this piece because this theme really cascades down into most of the other sections as well. So first thing that we would love to highlight, really want to highlight is this change here. And you see that there is text that's struck through, and then there's the bold. So when we look at these pieces that strike through are things that are being proposed to be removed, and then the bold is proposed to be added in. So what this key theme does is we've seen throughout this elimination of any references to protected classes, to racial, ethnic, sexual stereotypes and biases. We know that this is really, really important. We know that from state anti-discrimination laws, the recent divisive concepts legislation, that really, in order to truly protect students, to protect teachers, that we need to hone in, we need to expand the umbrella rather than doing away with it altogether and being more ambiguous with this language. That being really specific and direct provides school leaders, provides staff and educators the guidance that they need to really create meaningful and affirming and welcoming and really safe learning environments. That, that broadening that scope can be really problematic and can create a lot of confusion at the local level. And one thing that we really do want to say is that we want to be clear that the rule before this proposed change, that's by absolutely no means perfect. But this, if they're talking about creating more equitable learning environments, this is an opportunity for the department and for people who were working on these rules to really think through, hey, we're changing this. How can we change it in a way that creates more welcoming, more affirming learning environments and really more welcoming and supportive spaces for teachers, for students, and make it really a more proactive policy. But instead, what they did was they took this and they introduced more ambiguity, and that can be really concerning when we think about the larger context in which we are operating in terms of public school policy. These standards really set the baseline for school leaders, and by removing them or really diluting them like this, they don't give the support or direction that school leaders need to do this, to really do this work effectively. And that's really a theme that we've seen in a lot of these changes, is really a stripping down of requirements and really broadening of requirements and those kinds of things, where we know that these minimum standards, school leaders, school boards, they really point to these requirements when they think about policies and say, hey, we're using these to guide our own policies. And without that direction, it can be pretty challenging in some communities to get these pieces implemented and that kind of thing. So another change that really raised our eyebrows was the removal of the requirement that school administrators and staff really work together to establish a fair and equitable code of discipline. We know that exclusionary policies like suspensions and expulsions, they've been talked about a lot at the state and administrative level. There have been some legislative changes in the past couple of years. We know that student discipline is a big challenge for some of our communities. And so this is a really alarming elimination. Removing that requirement is, does this bring us closer to creating a more just learning environment for students, without that requirement of a fair and equitable code of discipline that really school leaders can really rely on to model best practices in school-wide discipline. Removing that language can really remove the scaffolding and support the teachers benefit from in ensuring that their classroom and learning communities are just, are fair, and are inclusive. So this is another piece where we're really looking pretty closely at as we move through this work. Some of the proposed changes require districts to adopt a plan to address, quote, academic underperformance. And this is a drastic tone shift, where the current rules, what's currently in place, talk about equity gaps. They talk about, how can we reduce barriers to learning and that kind of thing. We're moving to talking about academic underperformance of individual students. And this is really, a macro versus micro change. We already do both looking at broad themes and broad trends, and really at the micro level, the student level. As teachers, you do that every single day. This proposal really eliminates that macro view. You work with individual students. You're always working with them. You're meeting with them. You're meeting with their families and saying, hey, how can we help your student really learn better and meet these benchmarks. But removing this requirement where we're looking at equity gaps and looking at these systemic barriers that students face, that can be really hard when we start to think about how can we create more affirming, more robust learning environments for all of our students. Sorry. Sorry, my 3-year-old just asked me for a Reese's cup. He finished his dinner, so it's a Reese's cup for him. So when we think about, public policy at the state level, we really need both these high level pieces where we're looking at equity gaps, where we're looking at school statewide pieces, and really that micro student level piece. They both work together in really a symbiotic way, but removing that macro piece can be really challenging when we want to look at, how can we support our schools statewide. And so in wrapping up this equity theme, in talking about this, it comes with a couple of questions and implications. So, as you move through this work, as we start talking about this more as a state, here are some thoughts around, what questions do we want you to leave with, and what are some pieces that, we really want you to consider when you're moving through this work. And they come in a couple of different places. How does broadening the scope of biases to the point of ambiguity really affect the field? Particularly when we're talking about the context that we're in with the Divisive Concepts Law, with changes to the Code of Ethics and Code of Conduct in those kinds of environments. The proposed revisions really do remove the requirement for a fair and equitable code of discipline. When we're talking about discipline, we know that students of color and students with disabilities are disproportionately punished with those exclusionary practices. This was really an opportunity for the state to really consider that and move it forward and set clear expectations and lay out evidence-based strategies to help all of our students succeed, and create really those safe learning environments that we all need for an affirming learning environment. It is our belief that these rule changes really move our state away from inclusive, equitable, and just schools. So those are some pieces that we will be watching out for when we start having these conversations at the state level. The next piece is around program elements, and we're going to go through a couple of examples, but just something to look out for when we're talking about this section in particular. Program elements are referred to in the Administrative 306 rules as program standards. We have renamed them program elements because it's sort of like an inception scenario where you're talking about program standards inside of minimum standards, and there's also academic standards. And so standards, like, you can talk about standards all day long, and they kind of touch different pieces. So we've referred to these pieces as program elements. The distinction is really important because academic standards, they tend to focus on what students should know and be able to do. The intent and longstanding practice of program elements in New Hampshire is a more global set of expectations for each content area. So we're going to look through them through a couple of examples. So as I mentioned, those program elements or the program standards, if you're reading the actual text, they offer a core framework and a foundational guidance from which to design learning programs. These elements convey the minimum expectations for learning programs, and they really act sort of as the floor for which all schools and educators design learning from. They can include how educators design and revise curriculum, how students are assessed on the content, a number of other things, which you can see here. So this is a ton of text. I will say that out loud. Here we are. But we thought that it would be really useful to do a side-by-side comparison. So on the left here, you see a sample of the current ELA and reading rules within the Ed 306s. And this isn't even all of them. This is just some of them. So, it talks about instruction. It talks about the environment which promotes the importance of reading. It talks about intervention and remediation, and it's specific. It sets these parameters for teachers to create their programs. Now, compare that with what you see on the right. I want everyone to really see this paragraph with the entire proposed ELA and reading rules here, where it starts, the school board shall provide, that paragraph is the entirety of the new program elements. And this isn't just an ELA and reading. This is in every single content area. So it's cut and pasted. It is boilerplate language. So, you know, you start to see elements that detail expectations for the learning environment really be shifted to this boilerplate language that replaces all of that detail with just comprehensive, developmentally appropriate, personalized, sequential language programs. And something else that's really important to know here is that terms like developmentally appropriate aren't actually defined. So you're replacing it, or the proposal is to replace it with this boilerplate language and then not define what that means. And so this is concerning on a number of areas. Something else that's really important here, and sorry, I'm just going to hone on this just a little bit more, is that schools are evaluated on whether or not they meet these standards for public school approval. These are for public school approval, without any definition or guidance or framework for what this actually means. You know, we start to think about, okay, so what are schools going to be assessed on? Like, what, when the DOE comes and makes sure that you are aligning to these standards, what are the metrics they're going to use? What are the benchmarks they're going to use? And so, you know, this is something that we will be continuously keeping in mind. We are hearing a lot of concern in the field around how this will affect schools. And so when we think about questions and implications for moving forward, with little or no detail on the framework for designing learning programs, it introduces an opportunity for variation across districts. So when we talk about, you know, an equitable opportunities for all of our students, but we are really cutting down what those requirements are, that leads us more into the area of introducing more inequity, because, you know, some districts in some communities will always do what was on that left column. They will always have these robust programs. Other districts may not have the opportunity to offer those for a variety of reasons if they're not required. We've heard from a lot of people who have said, you know, I go to my school board and I say, you know, these program elements are required. You need to create your budget based on these. We need this. It is required by the state. And so by removing that, removing those requirements, it could make it harder in some communities for schools to make that case to their school boards.
Christina, there's a question in the chat from Brooke.
Sure.
Regarding program elements, does the new version only address 9 to 12? And are there varied minimums per content area?
Yeah, sorry. So right here, this example says learning levels 9 through 12. For the other areas, it would say something like K through 8 or learning levels 1 through 8. So sometimes it does kind of tease out high school from the other grades, but it's still that boilerplate language. That's really the extent of it.
And Lynn made the observation, not a question, that it's interesting that on gutting program elements, there's no language about teacher support and training for the area.
Yes, that is a great point. Yes, absolutely. For sure. So the next piece we're gonna talk about is local control. So there are a number of themes here in terms of local control. The proposed rules have removed all references to district content and graduation competencies. It appears as though the rules are moving more towards a statewide graduation expectation model, and I'm putting expectation in quotes because you know, some people have referred to them as competencies. We're hearing that there is resistance by calling them actual competencies, a list of these 24 competencies required for graduation. But there's, certain people don't want to call them competencies, they want to call them expectations. So moving towards this statewide graduation expectation model, removing all note of district content and graduation competencies, that's really important because we know how much work districts and schools have put into crafting these competencies and crafting these standards. And so to eliminate them altogether is something that had really concerned us. There's no customization at the local content specific or program level. As well, the proposed rules eliminate the mention of mastery of competency, which is used right now in the current version of the 306s. Under the proposed draft rules, districts would be required to graduate students based on the acknowledgement of competencies. And I want to say, based on the acknowledgement of competencies, that's quite a departure from mastery of competencies. This is really important when we start to talk about courses that build on each other or that may have prerequisites, like math, like world language, like other courses, like sciences, those kinds of courses. When we talk about moving on competencies, that switch from mastery to acknowledgement is a really interesting one. It really invites a lot of questions around what is competence, and is it, when we're talking about a minimum level of competency, what does that mean? And then finally, one of the other key themes when we're talking about local control is that the proposed revisions appear to remove the role of certified educators in determining competency. This we've taken as a disregard of the expertise that certified educators offer in ensuring that students are ready to move on. So not only are we moving from mastery to acknowledgement, we're also removing the certified educator from that process in determining whether or not a student is ready to move on. And that's a really important piece. And so just to sort of hone in a little bit more on that acknowledgement versus mastery, we heard this from somebody, we heard this analogy, and I thought it was a really interesting one that we want to really, that we've been sharing quite a bit. And so moving from acknowledgement to mastery, this hammer, acknowledgement, the student knows how to use a hammer. They know how to put the nail in the wood, bam. Mastery is a little different. Mastery is, you know how to use the hammer. Yes, you can do the nail, but you also know how to use that hammer when the nail breaks, when the wood splits, if something goes wrong. You know how to use that skill under a number of different scenarios. It's not just, you know how to use the hammer for that one particular one and boop, you nailed it, you check it off, you're on to the next thing. You've mastered the use of that hammer, you know how to use that hammer. And so when we're thinking about this change within the rules, that's something that we are really interested in following. We will be watching this really, really closely in terms of what does it mean for students and what does it mean for their progression of learning. And so finally, wrapping up the local control section, how are locally developed competencies, competency assessments, graduation requirements, how are they impacted with the really complete removal in reference to district competency and graduation competencies? And what are the implications for high school credit when that threshold for credit is acknowledgement rather than mastery? What does that mean for students? What does that mean for their progression of learning? And sorry, I'm noting the time, so I'm going to pick it up just a bit. Sorry about that. Quickly going through the new requirements, there is a new requirement that every student has a personal learning plan, which is defined as a policy for how districts utilize personalized learning plans, which are the process by which each student is assisted to develop and continually revise as needed their personal learning plan. This is very similar to what we've seen in Vermont. Vermont passed a law in 2013 that requires all students have a personalized learning plan for students in grades 7 through 12. There is a lot of concern, both in Vermont and here in New Hampshire, when we start talking about this, around students with IEPs, who are on IEPs. These are very new. When you look at the broad scheme of things, they're very new in Vermont too. We've talked to a couple of people there who, have said these personalized learning plans, they take a lot of work to implement well. The personalized learning plans in the 306s, we have a lot of questions because they're sort of just dropped in there. There doesn't appear to be any requirements for training. There doesn't appear to be any resources or professional development attached with them around how can schools and educators implement these well and implement these, in a meaningful way. What resources are the Department of Education, are the state going to provide to schools to actually do this work? It's a lot of work. These are very, these are impactful pieces that require thought and that require preparation, require training to do well. We haven't seen any proposals for how the department or how the state are going to assist districts in implementing these new requirements. So a couple of questions that we're also asking, is there legislation that will be required to put these into practice? One of the questions we've been hearing in the field is, can you even do these personalized learning plans through administrative rules? Do lawmakers actually need to put this into law before you can start that rulemaking process? We haven't heard anything so far in terms of legislation. So that's something we will be watching in the next session. What professional development opportunities and resources do schools and educators need to meet these requirements effectively? And that is something that we will be watching really, really closely because, if not, this is effectively an unfunded mandate. And so, how can we, if this is going to be a requirement of schools, how can we help support? What supports do they need to be able to implement these well? And so the last key theme is around definitions. And these really are, as I had mentioned earlier, these are changes that really minimize formal instruction and minimize the role of the certified educator. So in order to kind of work through this key theme, we're going to be looking at a couple of different language changes throughout the rules. So throughout the document, courses are changed to learning opportunities. Instructional is changed to learning. A couple of questions that we asked are, what classifies as a learning opportunity? Courses, we talk about courses, we know what courses are, but these are learning opportunities. Shifting that, it's a pretty subtle shift, but it could be a really impactful shift for sure. And the same with instructional to learning. There are a lot of open questions as to whether these references are really a hint towards introducing more private programs, like those are approved through Learn Everywhere and things like that. And that's sort of why at the top of the presentation, we said, hey, Learn Everywhere, non-public schools, those kinds of programs, those are in different sets of rules. And to sort of mix them in with these minimum standards for public school approval, this is really raising our eyebrows and something we are watching really closely. In addition to that, the definition of instructional time will be changed to, the current definition of instructional time is the amount of time in which students are actively working toward achieving their educational objectives. That definition is changing to the amount of time in the school day in which the school is offering instruction. So, this opens up some questions around a number of different initiatives that we've seen in other states, whether that's bringing in private options, whether that's, part-time schooling and that kind of thing. So those are pieces that, when we start to look at all of these together, it's building this puzzle that we are seeing as a possible effort to really minimize the role of the public school. And then there are a couple of changes around the length of school year and talking about competency, not seat time, which is something that, we would expect if in some of these other places. So with these pieces, with these puzzle pieces, the changing of courses to learning opportunities, the change of instruction to to learning, and this really this de-emphasis of, you know, of formal instruction. It started to churn our wheels in this idea around unbundling, which we've started to see in the past couple of years, the term unbundling really pop up in privatization circles. So we have a couple of quotes here. One is from EdChoice, which is a pro-privatization organization. They'd advocated for vouchers, school vouchers. They've advocated for really minimizing public schools and privatizing and commodifying education. And so this is where we first started seeing that unbundling term. And you can see this quote, you know, rather than operating classes in-house that may be expensive or difficult to find teachers for, imagine if they simply paid for students to get that learning somewhere else in the community. That's really the theme of unbundling. It's, hey, how can we break apart public school and commodify it and outsource it to private organizations? And so when we look at some of these terminology changes, especially in the context of what we've seen with the Department of Education more broadly in the past couple of years, what we've seen in the legislature, particularly in the past 2 years, this is a theme that we are really concerned about. Drew Klein, who's the chair of the State Board of Education, he's also the president of the Josiah Bartlett Center, which is a conservative think tank. He had talked about bundling services in an NHPR article. So, you know, when we start to think about weaving these pieces together, this is something that we are watching really, really closely. And so with that, we're going to just quickly take the next couple of minutes. Oh, 6:40. We're going to take the next couple of minutes to talk about the process so far. What has the process been? And really, where do we go from here? So a little bit about the minimum standards. I really want to set the scene here. This is just a quick overview of the scope of what the minimum standards for public school approval are. They include policy requirements, school facilities, staff qualifications and professional development, assessment, approval processes, those program elements that we talked about earlier, class sizes, all of these big things. The scope is very wide. What we really want everyone to know is how wide these are and how important it is to have a really inclusive, thorough process if we're going to talk about revising them. And to date, the process has not been inclusive at all. There were 2 certified education professionals on the work group. One was a certified superintendent. One was a certified school principal of a high school. There were no certified teachers from elementary, middle, or high school, no practicing teachers. There were no special education experts. There were no students. There were no parents. There were no curriculum experts. You know, this process was kept really close and closed. It was a very closed process. And so, you know, when we think about the scope, that's really problematic. Not having everyone at this table is really problematic if we're going to be talking about really this huge overhaul of these minimum standards and really rethinking what it is that we want for this foundation for our public schools. And when we talk about process, we thought that one way to really drive home the point of the process would be to actually compare it with a different process. So for those of you who may work in the social studies space, you know, you may know that the state very recently adopted academic standards for the teaching about the Holocaust and about genocide. Those standards were really crafted in this commission that lawmakers created. They determined the committee membership to ensure representation in varied perspectives. There were public meetings, there were public minutes, contact information was publicly posted. You can see a screenshot here of Keene State College of their webpage. You can see all their minutes. You can see everything, all of their links. The commission created standards. They brought them to the state board, and they really went from there. It was a very open, it was a very transparent process. You can still see what they talked about their meetings on YouTube. Very transparent. Now let's compare that with the 306 revision to date. So backtracking a little bit, the New Hampshire Department of Education contracted this revision out to a third-party company in 2020. That company was the National Center for Competency-Based Learning, headed by Fred Bramante. If people are in this work, that might be a name that is familiar to you. There were no public meetings, there were no public minutes, no public input until there remains to be no opportunity for really authentic public input. NCCBL, the contractor, and the New Hampshire Department of Education have revised this proposal without public input. They have gone back and forth together. Still no opportunity for public input. Earlier this summer, that July date that I was talking about at the beginning, the contractor sent a couple of associations draft rules for their review. Still no opportunity for public input. We have heard that the contractor is hosting listening sessions in the fall. We don't know when they will be. We don't know where they will be. Timeframe really unknown. And they're expected to present the proposed rule revisions to the state board. Not sure when. It could be as early as their November 10th meeting. We've heard a number of different things. We've heard in a couple of spheres that it could be that November 10th where they bring this revision proposal, this draft to the state board to start the rulemaking process. A couple of people have gone to the state board to ask, when is the public going to have the opportunity to weigh in on these pieces? The state board and department have said, oh, you'll have an opportunity for input when rulemaking starts, which is when they introduce them to the state board and that formal rulemaking process starts. They are legally required to have a public hearing on them. However, one of the concerns that we have had is that, the state board has a public hearing with the Learn Everywhere rules, with the statewide school voucher rules. A lot of people gave feedback, and at the end of the day, it didn't really move the needle. And so that's one of the big concerns of having most of the public input be at that public hearing from the state board. So we are monitoring this really, really closely. We are, once we know when there's opportunity, we will share it out loud, like we will spread the word so that everyone has the opportunity to get involved. And so just really going over once more the scope, really wide scope. It's really important that there are a lot of people at this table. There haven't been so far. Looking ahead, there is an opportunity for a possible legislative fix. So there is a state rep who submitted an LSR, a sort of a bill bookmark, I like to say. It's a little piece of legislation it's like a seed. It's like a legislative seed where they say, okay, I'm going to be filing this bill next year. We've seen this in LSR 206. This would establish a commission to evaluate and recommend standards for public schools. We hear that this will be very similar to that Holocaust and Genocide Standards Commission, where it would be a large table. There would be a lot of representation. They would essentially start the process over and think through, hey, what is it that we want for our public schools? And how do we craft these minimum standards in order to get there? With a lot of people at that table, a lot of public input. It's expected to be introduced in January 2023. And so this is one piece that we'll be watching pretty closely. In terms of next steps, as I said, the rules could be introduced to the state board as soon as November 2022. There's nothing preventing them from doing it really at their next meeting, which is on November 10th. What can members do? So you can use, regional meetings, you can use staff days or whatever it is to help brief your members, to talk about proposed changes, to really think through of, okay, what are our big concerns and how can we communicate that in a really effective way? Also, that LSR, that little seed for the bill, is an opportunity for the state to start over in a more inclusive way. And so, one opportunity may be saying, hey, listen, like this is a chance for us to start clean. This is a chance for us to go back to the drawing board. Think about what as educators, as communities want for our public schools, and is this the best way to go forward? Something else you can do is meeting with other school staff to ensure that everyone's on the same page and they know of your concerns and they know that the effect that this would have on your students, on your profession, and really helping to spread the word about this change, about these proposed changes, about this process. And so with that, I hope there's a couple of minutes. It looks like we got about 11 minutes left for any questions, conversation, totally open. If you have any questions that you don't want to share now, but would like to email me, feel free, my email's right there. And so I'm not sure.
Misty Compton has a question. George, she's got her hand raised. Can we unmute her? Or?
Is it working?
Yes, I hear you, Misty.
Hi, Misty.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for letting me come into the conversation, and I appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Very much. I guess, my question that I have for this, at this time is, now you mentioned that I know firsthand that there's some teachers who are going to be involved in, taking a look at this and doing some analysis. But did you say that there has been an opportunity so far for teachers? What did you say would be their opportunity to talk about the implications? Were you thinking at an event like this, or is there a time where people could sort of give some sort of concrete examples of how their particular work would be affected?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So far, that session, I think if you're referring to the November 15th and 16th one, where educators are going somewhere with the Department of Ed to give some feedback, that's really been the first opportunity that we've seen where educators can come in and really share their thoughts. Some people have had success in emailing either work group members or Fred Bramante directly. And their contact information is right on our website. I can send you the link and everything. I can send you all the link after. But some people have had success in talking directly to work group members or the contractor himself. I know that can be a little bit intimidating, but there's that work group on the 15th and 16th, and then there are supposed to be listening sessions that the contractor is holding through the fall. We've heard a lot of different things. We've heard, they were supposed to happen in September, then they were supposed to happen in October. Now we're not sure when they're going to happen, but
yeah, and
they
promised.
But...
And I guess I meant more, not just like a general public one, but just just teachers, people, I should say educators, people working direct with students, currently, and that can include, administrators, so somewhat as well. But I guess I was just wondering, about harvesting that information even prior, just based on where my head's going right now, that information prior to the 15th and 16th. Because can you remind me again how many teachers are part of that revision meeting?
That meeting, I actually don't know. I'm not involved in the planning of it. I've heard about 20. I don't know, Irv, if you've heard different, but I think in an email I saw they were looking for 20 educators.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a pretty good cross section. I couldn't remember if it was only like, the amount you could count on one hand, or if it had kind of grown to more. So I mean, I think you could probably get a lot of concrete examples out of that group. So thank you so much for answering my question.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I think, we're looking forward to hearing about how that went. And I think something else that would be good for educators to do is to really make sure that feedback is incorporated in whatever document comes out. So really following through and they give those 2 days and making sure that those changes are reflected in whatever is proposed will be really important too.
Thanks, Christina. Dawn, you had a question?
I do. I'm working right now with a very low special ed group. The relaxing of standards of behavior, I'm all messed up with the language. Expectations, standards, elements. These children, the group has an average ability level of about first grade, and they are 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. My ability to help them means that I have to individualize for each one. I can't see these standards, these new guidelines as being a positive thing. How can we be retrained to meet these standards? I said that badly. Some of these guidelines fly in the face of why a lot of us chose to be teachers.
Yeah.
And it flies in the face of how we trained to be teachers.
And I think, Dawn, this is Irv talking, they're not finalized yet. And one of the reasons that we wanted to bring this to your attention was the kinds of things that you're concerned about are things that we hope you share with the people developing these standards.
Yep. And the opportunity to do that is in November.
Well, that's part of the problem. We're not really sure when it is, but George, the communications person for NEA New Hampshire and the leadership there will make sure that it's in the insider and in the communications that go out to you as a member.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for coming tonight, Don.
And I think that is a big reason why, and I'm glad Christina brought up the process part of this, is we're really not sure and not confident in what that feedback process is going to look like. And as we've seen in other programs that the Department of Education has initiated over the last several years, we've seen, that the plan was already built, and the feedback, as was said earlier, was sort of inconsequential. And so, which is why we really wanted to hone in on that there needs to be a different process to such a broad and sweeping change to these rules. We're not just talking about dotting some I's and crossing some T's in our for our minimum standards, we're talking about a major overhaul. And we don't want to get to a situation where we've already begun a process that essentially has already ended. And I think that's why that we wanted to bring this to all of you, and we hope that you will, as a next step, share this information with your fellow members, with your colleagues, so that they know just what is at stake with some of the potential changes that we have already seen and that Christina has outlined thus far.
And Jennifer had a question, and this will be the last one, I think, Christina. And people can email anyone at NEA New Hampshire or email you if they have further questions. Can LEAs, local education agencies, work with the unions to have higher standards in their collective bargaining agreements? And is there any interest in doing so? And this may be a Brian or a Megan question that we can get back to rather than you, Christina, because. So Brian, what if we chose to negotiate at our school a higher standard in our collective bargaining agreement than the state requires?
You know, I think this goes to a point that Christina made earlier in her presentation, which is, you know, the high standards are important to create a minimum threshold for all students across the state. And while that may be possible in some school districts, in other school districts, it may not. For any of you who have been part of the collective bargaining process, it is, you know, it takes two entities to agree, and that may happen in some places, it may not happen in others. And those aren't the types of things that we want to leave up to chance for students. We already have, as many of you know, an education funding problem in the state that causes all kinds of inequities in and of itself. For us to exacerbate that with standards that are vague and not what we're used to, that's not the direction we want to go in. So we saw this earlier this year when the commissioner tried to gut some of the core subject areas from inadequate education, where they wanted to eliminate arts, foreign languages,
Physical
etc.
education.
Yes.
Mhm.
And because of all of your advocacy, the legislature responded in rejecting that approach and actually ended up expanding the core standards, the core subject areas, content areas. And so that's what we're going to need going forward. But we need everyone to know, as I said, what's at stake and what these standards and the implications of changing them in some of the ways that Christina talked about tonight are. So please, you know, share this when you go to your school tomorrow morning. If you're in the break room, if you have a union meeting coming up, please encourage people to access this webinar. You'll be hearing more from NEA New Hampshire directly about this and about the advocacy opportunities that will be coming up. Maybe I'll close it out there and thank everybody for joining us. I didn't mention it earlier. My name is Brian Hawkins. I'm your government relations director. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Christina, for your presentation. That must have been an amazing Reese's cup you gave your son. He's been very quiet, so.
They got the Reese's cup in there watching a movie, so. It's just my dog now that's here and bugging me to feed her.
Right. Thanks, everybody. And again, it will be recorded and we will send you the link to it.